Everyone laughed when an old man named Samuel Brooks spent his last few dollars on a rusty fire truck from the junkyard. They called him delusional, said he'd lost his mind, but no one imagined that this forgotten relic that would one day save an entire town from burning to ashes. A man, his loyal dog, and an old machine prove that faith and love can turn rust into miracles. Subscribe to the channel and comment where you're watching this story from. Chapter 1. The Rusted Fire Truck. The sky hung low over Maple Hollow, bruised with clouds that smelled faintly of iron and rain. The air had that heavy stillness that precedes a storm, a stillness Samuel Brooks had come to know too well, both in weather and in life. He stood at the edge of the scrapyard, boots sinking into the damp soil, staring at the hulking shape before him. It was an old 1956 fire engine, paint peeled to the bone, its once bright red now a scabbed brown. A fractured hose dangled like a torn limb, and weeds had begun to grow through the wheel wells. To anyone else, it was scrap metal, a corpse of industry. But to Samuel, it was a promise whispered through the rust. Samuel was 60, broad-shouldered but stooped, with hands calloused from decades of labor. His face carried the map of hard years, creases carved deep by sun and sorrow. His beard was gray and uneven, his eyes an ash blue that could be both gentle and fierce. He wore the same flannel shirt he'd patched a dozen times, and on his left wrist hung a silver watch that had stopped ticking the night his wife died. He rarely spoke more than he needed to. Words had weight to him, and life had already proven how easily they could sink. A bark broke through his thoughts, sharp, urgent, familiar. Buddy trotted up beside him, tail wagging, fur dusted with grime. The German Shepherd was 5 years old, strong but lean, his coat a blend of black and tan, eyes bright amber and startlingly human. He had a way of looking directly into people, as if measuring their souls. Samuel had found him as a half-starved pup behind the grain mill years ago. Since then, Buddy had been more than a dog. He was Samuel's shadow, his echo, the only creature that never judged him for the ghosts he carried. "Don't look at me like that," Samuel muttered, running a hand over Buddy's head. "You think I'm crazy too?" Buddy tilted his head, ears flicking at the sound of distant thunder. Somewhere behind them, a crow cawed as if to agree. From the shack at the gate, the yard manager ambled out, a wiry man in oil-stained overalls with a cigarette glued to his lower lip. His name was Earl Jenkins, a man with too much suspicion and too little patience. "You sure you want to spend money on that thing, Brooks?" he rasped. "Ain't nothing but a dead mule on wheels. She hasn't moved since the Reagan years." His laugh was the kind that didn't need company. It fed itself. Samuel dug into his pocket, fingers brushing against the last crumpled bills he owned. 200. You said 200'd take it. Earl exhaled smoke through his nose. "You got a plan for it, or just gonna let it decorate your yard? Folks already talk, you know, you and that dog living out there like a couple of ghosts." Samuel didn't look up. "Everyone's got their ghosts, Earl. Some just have louder ones." He signed the paper, handed over the bills, and with that, the fire truck, this skeletal beast of metal, was his. As he watched the loader hitch chains to its frame, Samuel felt a strange pull in his chest. Not pride exactly, but something quieter, older. Redemption, maybe? The drive back to his property took nearly an hour. The fire engine groaned on the trailer, every bump echoing like thunder. The road wound through tired farmland and fences held together more by memory than nails. Maple Hollow wasn't much of a town anymore, half its houses empty, the rest sagging under debt and drought. It was the kind of place where everyone knew your business and discussed it over coffee before you'd even finished doing it. By the time Samuel reached his land, dusk was bleeding across the horizon. His farm wasn't large, 10 acres of stubborn earth, a barn leaning like an old drunk, and a weathered house with peeling paint. Yet it was his, every inch earned through sweat and the ache of a back that no longer healed as it used to. He parked the trailer near the barn, climbed down, and watched as Buddy sniffed the air, circling the truck like a sentry. The sound of gravel crunching drew his attention. A small pickup pulled up by the fence, headlights cutting through the gloom. The driver's door opened, and Margaret Maggie Hayes stepped out, a woman of 58 with auburn gray hair tied in a loose bun, laugh lines deepened by years of smiling through hardship. She ran the local diner, Maggie's Table, where the coffee was always too strong and the kindness free. She was short but solid, with a kind of calm that made others slow down when she spoke. Her apron was dusted with flour, her hands still smelling faintly of cinnamon. "Well, I'll be," she said, leaning against the fence. You really did it. Samuel wiped his hands on his jeans. Did what? Brought home that thing. She nodded toward the fire truck. Half the town's been laughing since morning. Ol' Sam's building himself an army, they say. Her smile softened. Guess they've forgotten what it means to build anything at all. Samuel managed a small grin. It's a heap of metal, Maggie, but maybe it'll be something else. Maggie stepped closer, setting a small cardboard box on the fence post. Pie, apple, figured you'd forget dinner again. He hesitated. You didn't have to. I know, she interrupted. But if I waited for you to ask, you'd starve out of stubbornness. Buddy wagged his tail and gave a hopeful whine. Maggie bent down to scratch his neck. And how's my favorite gentleman tonight, huh? The dog leaned into her touch, tongue lolling, eyes half closed with bliss. Samuel watched, an odd warmth blooming in his chest. It had been a long time since laughter had filled his yard. When Maggie left, the light in the house dimmed and the night stretched wide. Samuel sat beside the truck, the metal still warm from the sun. He traced the outline of a faded emblem on the door, Maple County Fire Department, Engine Number 3. The letters were nearly gone, but the shape of them stirred memories he'd buried deep. He saw fire, the old house, the orange glare, the way the smoke had rolled across the fields like a living thing. He remembered the sirens that never came in time, the voice that went silent in his arms, and the cold that followed him for years afterward. He could still hear the last words of his wife, Laura, whispered through smoke. Don't blame them, Sam. It wasn't their fault. But he had blamed them. Every one of those fire engines that didn't roar down the road fast enough. Every spark that found its way into his dreams. Maybe this machine wasn't just steel and rust. Maybe it was a way to stop blaming. He rose slowly, joints creaking. Buddy patted after him as he fetched a lantern and set it on the truck's hood. The glow spilled across the battered metal, revealing 1,000 tiny scars. He ran his fingers over the hose couplings, the rusted pump, the broken gauge. We'll make you work again, he murmured. Not to fight fire this time, maybe to fight thirst. Buddy tilted his head. Samuel chuckled softly. You don't understand, do you? This thing's not for burning, it's for saving. He imagined fitting it with a water purifier, a pump strong enough to draw from the shallow well that still hadn't run dry. A portable clean water rig, something the town could use when the next drought hit. He had read about such projects in distant places, men turning junk into salvation. Why not here? Why not him? The wind picked up, carrying the scent of rain mixed with rust and old dreams. Samuel closed his eyes. For the first time in years, he felt purpose, not grand, but steady, like the slow turning of gears. Thunder rolled far off. Buddy barked once, sharp, ears pricked. The dog's eyes fixed on the barn, pupils narrowing. Samuel followed his gaze. The shadows near the open door seemed to shift, as if someone, or something, had moved inside. He froze, breath caught, listening. The lantern flame flickered violently, then steadied. He reached for the wrench on the truck bed, his knuckles white around the handle. "Who's there?" he called, voice low but firm, no answer. Just the soft patter of rain beginning to fall. Buddy growled, the sound deep and throaty. The barn creaked in reply. Old wood, or maybe not. For a moment, Samuel could have sworn he saw a faint glimmer, like eyes, deep within the darkness. Then lightning flashed across the sky, and the shape was gone. He stood there for a long while, the rain dripping from the brim of his hat, until finally he exhaled and whispered, almost to himself, "Looks like we've got company, boy." Buddy's tail stiffened, a low rumble still in his throat. Inside the barn, something clinked, a metal sound, deliberate and slow. And just as the thunder cracked above them, the fire truck let out a low, ghostly hiss, as if it had exhaled for the first time in decades. Chapter 2. Hammers, Bolts, and Apple Pie. Morning sunlight spilled through the cracks of Samuel's worn-out curtains, painting gold stripes across the dust that floated lazily in the air. The smell of oil and old wood lingered like a memory that refused to fade. Outside, the fire truck waited in silence, streaked with dew, its frame glinting faintly as though waking from a long sleep. Samuel stepped out with his thermos in hand, Buddy padding beside him, tail wagging in slow rhythm. "You ready for another day, boy?" he murmured. The dog answered with a low bark, stretching his long frame before settling beside the toolbox. It had been a week since that strange night, the night something had stirred inside the barn, and the truck had hissed as if breathing. Samuel still wasn't sure if he'd imagined it. But each dawn since, when he ran his hands along the metal, he could swear it felt warmer, almost alive. During the day, Samuel worked wherever he could find labor. The lumberyard paid him by the hour, loading, lifting, sweating under the merciless sun. His coworkers treated him with that careful mix of pity and distance reserved for men who had lost too much. One of them, Ben Tully, was a stout man in his 50s, face weathered like bark, beard flecked with sawdust. Ben was kind in a rough-edged way. He liked to talk, but never pry. "You're rebuilding that old truck, huh?" he asked one noon, wiping his brow. "Heard you dragged it out of Jenkins's yard." Samuel nodded. "Trying to." Ben chuckled. "Well, if you need bolts, I've got a crate of spares. Ain't worth much, but they'll hold things together." There was something genuine in the offer, the kind of decency that doesn't need ceremony. Samuel accepted with a silent nod. For a man like him, gratitude was best expressed through work, not words. By dusk, he would return to his property, shoulders aching, pockets nearly empty, but mind already spinning with plans. The fire truck stood like a monument in his yard, waiting. He fetched the tools, wrenches, wire brushes, buckets of vinegar water, and set to work. Buddy, ever watchful, learned his own tasks. When Samuel dropped a wrench, Buddy fetched it. When the air compressor sputtered too loudly, Buddy barked twice, his version of an alert. They moved in a rhythm, man and dog, bound by quiet understanding. The sound of scraping metal filled the twilight, sparks flying as Samuel ground away the rust that had buried decades of memory. "You see, Buddy," he said one night, sweat dripping from his temples, "people rot the same way metal does, slowly, quietly, till someone decides we're worth fixing." It was past midnight when the headlights of a pickup swept across the yard. Maggie's truck rolled to a stop near the barn, and she climbed out, balancing a small, covered tray. Her auburn gray hair was tied loosely, catching the light of the lantern as she approached. "You didn't show up for dinner again," she said, her voice half stern, half warm. "So I brought dinner to you." She uncovered the tray, apple pie, still warm, the scent of cinnamon cutting through the metallic air. "You're gonna waste away if all you eat is guilt and rust." Samuel tried to smile. "You should be asleep." Maggie brushed a strand of hair from her face. "You should be too, but I can see that's a lost cause." Her gaze traveled over the fire truck, her eyes softening. "It's starting to look like something again. Not sure what yet, but something." "Still a long way off," Samuel said. She handed him a slice of pie on a tin plate. "Maybe so, but long roads have views too. You just have to look up now and then." Buddy wagged his tail, nose twitching at the pie. Maggie laughed and tore off a small piece for him. "He's got better manners than you do." Samuel chuckled quietly, a rare sound. They ate in silence for a while, the kind of silence that felt comfortable. Then Maggie spoke again, softer now. "You know, Sam, not everyone gets a second chance at something that broke them. Maybe this is yours." He didn't answer. The words hit too close. Instead, he stared at the fire truck, remembering Laura's laughter, her hands smudged with flour as she baked. The smell of Maggie's pie brought the memory back too vividly, and he had to turn away before it swallowed him. The following days fell into rhythm. Samuel worked, repaired, studied. At night, he pored over an old manual for piston pumps he'd borrowed from the county library, a relic written by some long-dead engineer. The diagrams were complex, but he traced them slowly, lips moving as he whispered through the words. Sometimes he caught himself talking to the fire truck, as if it were listening. "If I can get that old pump turning," he'd mutter, "we'll move water yet." Buddy would wag his tail like he understood every word. One afternoon, as Samuel welded a new bracket near the front axle, the steady rhythm of hammering drew attention from the road. A teenage boy on a rusted bicycle stopped by the fence. His name was Tyler Moore, lanky and sunburned, no older than 16. His clothes hung loose on him, and his hair stuck out from beneath a backward cap. "Hey, Mr. Brooks," he called, voice cracking slightly. "My dad says you're fixing that fire truck. He thinks you're nuts." His grin was quick and mischievous, but not unkind. Samuel didn't look up. "Then your dad's in good company," Tyler laughed. "Can I watch? I like engines. Used to help my uncle with tractors." Samuel hesitated, then gestured toward the gate. "Don't touch anything hot." The boy leaned his bike and joined him, eyes wide with curiosity. "Wow, she's old, real old. You think she'll run again?" "She will," Samuel said simply. "Just needs someone who believes she can." Tyler nodded as though that made perfect sense. He stayed for an hour, handing Samuel tools and asking questions about pressure gauges and fuel lines. Buddy kept a close eye on him, but eventually relaxed enough to rest his chin on the boy's boot. When Tyler finally left, he waved from the road. "I'll come back tomorrow, Mr. Brooks. Maybe I can help again." Samuel only waved back, but there was a faint smile beneath his beard. That night, Samuel and Buddy attempted the first pump test. The new hoses were fitted, the bolts tightened, the tank half filled with rainwater collected from the roof. Maggie had come by again, uninvited but expected, wearing her old denim jacket and carrying a flashlight. "If this thing explodes," she teased, "I'm telling folks it was your idea." Samuel smirked. "Fair enough. Just don't let them bury me near Jenkins." Buddy barked once, tail wagging anxiously. The three of them stood together, the air thick with anticipation. Samuel turned the crank. The pump groaned, then sputtered, coughing out a spray of brown water before dying with a hiss. He tried again. Nothing. He frowned, checked the valve, and twisted it tighter. "Come on," he muttered. "Don't die on me now." He gave the crank one more pull. This time, the pump roared to life with a shudder that shook the truck. Water surged through the hose, gurgling, sputtering, and then the pressure valve burst open with a deafening pop. A geyser of water erupted, drenching all three of them in a freezing wave. Maggie shrieked, then burst into uncontrollable laughter. Buddy barked wildly, running circles in the mud. Samuel stood there, soaked and stunned, then laughed too, deep, unguarded laughter that rolled from his chest like thunder. For a moment, the years of grief washed away with the water. When the laughter finally faded, Maggie leaned against the truck, still breathless. "Well," she said between chuckles, "at least it works." "Barely," Samuel replied, wiping water from his eyes. "It's a start," she said softly. "Everything worth doing starts messy." They stayed there until the moon rose, silver light glinting off the wet steel. Samuel felt something shift inside him, not just pride, but hope, fragile and unfamiliar. He glanced toward Maggie, who stood with her arms folded, watching the moonlight dance across the truck's surface. For a fleeting second, she looked younger, the lines of worry smoothed away. He wanted to say something, to thank her, maybe, or ask her to stay longer, but the words caught in his throat. Instead, he whispered to Buddy, "We'll get it right next time." Buddy wagged his tail, eyes reflecting the lantern's glow. But as Samuel turned to shut down the pump, he noticed something strange, a faint pulse of light, deep inside the fire truck's open compartment, like the flicker of an ember. He leaned closer, frowning. "That's odd," he murmured. Maggie noticed his tone. "What is it?" He didn't answer right away. The glow pulsed again, just once, and vanished. "Probably nothing," he said finally, though his voice lacked conviction, just the reflection. But Buddy was staring at the same spot, ears forward, muscles tense. And when the wind shifted, carrying the scent of wet iron and something faintly electrical, Samuel felt the hairs on his neck rise. Chapter 3. Laughter and the Wind of Envy. The following morning dawned crisp and bright, the kind of day that seemed to promise decency even to those who didn't deserve it. But in Maple Hollow, decency had always been in short supply, and gossip, plentiful as dandelions, was the true local harvest. By noon, every coffee cup in Maggie's diner trembled with talk of Samuel Brooks and his toy fire truck. "Man's lost it," muttered Clara Jenkins, Earl's wife, a round-faced woman with hair the color of cigarette ash and the tongue of a parrot. "Spends all night talking to metal. Next thing you know, he'll be marrying that mutt of his." Laughter followed, sharp as glass. Even Maggie, wiping the counter, bit her lip to hold her temper. She'd learned long ago that arguing with gossip was like trying to catch smoke with your hands. It left you smelling of it. Outside, the wind carried those same words down the dirt road toward Samuel's farm, though he didn't need to hear them to know they existed. He could feel them, a low vibration beneath every glance at the market, every muttered chuckle from men too afraid of silence. But he kept working. The fire truck now sat half disassembled, its hood propped open like a wounded animal ready for surgery. The air smelled of oil and vinegar, metal shavings scattered like confetti. Buddy stood nearby, tail swishing, head cocked attentively at every clang of Samuel's wrench. "Toy fire truck, huh?" Samuel murmured. "Guess we'll see who's laughing when you're pumping water better than their fancy sprinklers." Buddy barked once, as though to agree. It was early afternoon when a black pickup rolled into the driveway, kicking up a cloud of dust. The man who stepped out was Carl Moore, the the richest landowner in Maple Hollow and, as some whispered, the most arrogant. He was in his early 60s, tall and broad, but softened by comfort, his belly pressing against a pearl-buttoned shirt, his hair silver, and slicked back with the precision of a man who never lifted anything heavier than a glass of whiskey. His face was a square fortress of pride, neatly trimmed beard hiding a smirk that rarely left him. Carl had inherited everything and earned nothing, a truth that seemed to cling to him like expensive cologne. "Morning, Brooks," Carl said, strolling up to the fire truck with hands in his pockets. "Heard you've been keeping the neighbors entertained." Samuel didn't look up. "Afternoon." Carl gave a long whistle, circling the truck. "Well, I'll be damned. You really did buy that heap from Jenkins. Looks worse up close. Tell you what, I'll give you 400 for it. Be generous of me, really, considering it's more rust than steel." Samuel's wrench froze mid-turn. He lifted his gaze, calm but steady. "It's not for sale." Carl chuckled, leaning an elbow on the truck's hood. "Everything's for sale, Brooks. Especially when you've got nothing left to lose." For a long moment, neither spoke. The wind picked up, carrying dust between them. Then Samuel wiped his hands on a rag and said quietly, "Some things stop being about money once you've lost enough of it." Carl studied him, smirk faltering for just a second before he shrugged. "Suit yourself. But when that thing collapses under its own weight, don't say I didn't offer you a way out." He turned back toward his truck, calling over his shoulder, "And keep that dog of yours off my property. My cattle don't need rabies." Buddy let out a low growl, and Samuel rested a hand on his neck. "Easy, boy. Let him bark all he wants." When Carl's truck disappeared down the road, the silence returned heavier than before. Samuel stood for a long while, looking at the fire truck, as if the insult had been aimed at both of them. "He doesn't get it," he said softly. "He's never had to fix something broken with his own hands." That evening, Maggie stopped by with supper packed in a paper bag. Her eyes searched his face, reading what words wouldn't say. "He came here, didn't he?" Samuel nodded once. She sighed. "Carl Moore thinks kindness is a kind of currency, but he's the poorest man I know." She set down the bag. "I brought stew. You need food more than pride tonight." Samuel smiled faintly. "You always bring something. Some people fix engines," she said. "Some fix hearts. I just feed both and hope one of them starts working." They ate on the porch as the sun slid low, painting the horizon in bruised oranges. Maggie's voice softened as she watched Buddy gnawing on a bone near the truck. "You know, Sam, I used to think you were trying to rebuild the past, but maybe you're building something new instead." Samuel didn't reply, but her words lingered in his chest long after she left. 2 days later, disaster struck. He'd spent the morning assembling the filter system, layers of sand, charcoal, and ceramic, all fitted into a metal drum connected to the truck's intake line. Tyler had come by again, dirt-smudged and eager, helping where he could. The boy's energy was infectious. His laugh reminded Samuel of something he'd forgotten, how joy sounded before life carved it down. "All right," Samuel said, tightening the last bolt. "Moment of truth." They filled the tank halfway with muddy pond water. The pump began to churn, groaning like a waking beast. For a moment it worked. Water sloshed, pressure rising. But then came the sound of a cough, a wheeze, and a wet splort. The entire system belched out a spray of thick brown sludge, coating Samuel, Tyler, and Buddy in filth. The filter barrel shook violently, then split at the seam, spewing mud across the ground. The pump died with a final choking hiss. Tyler froze, eyes wide. That's not supposed to happen, right?" Samuel didn't answer. His face, usually calm even in frustration, twisted into something darker, a rare storm breaking through. He hurled the wrench across the yard, metal clanging against the barn. "Damn it," Buddy whimpered softly, stepping closer. Samuel sank to his knees, hands trembling, breath ragged. For months he'd held himself together with willpower alone, but the laughter from town, the smirks, the failures, they all came crashing down now. Tyler backed away quietly, sensing the weight of a grown man's breaking point. I'll come back tomorrow, Mr. Brooks." By nightfall, the yard was silent again. Samuel sat by the truck in the glow of a single lantern, head bowed. His hands were black with grease, his heart heavier than steel. Buddy sat beside him, eyes glimmering with concern. Then, slowly, the dog rose, trotted into the house, and returned with something in his mouth. An old photograph, edges curled and damp from age. Laura's face smiled up from the faded paper, her eyes alive with the light Samuel had been chasing all this time. He took the photo gently, the corners trembling in his fingers. "You always knew when to show up," he whispered. Buddy rested his head on Samuel's knee, warm and steady. The lantern flickered, shadows dancing across the truck's frame. Somewhere deep inside the machine, water dripped steadily. A rhythmic tap, 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 like a heartbeat waiting to restart. Samuel looked up. "All right," he murmured. "One more try." The next morning, he scavenged through the junk pile behind the barn, pulling out an old generator he had found months earlier. It was small, dented, missing a handle, but when he turned it over, it still sparked faintly. He worked for hours, rewiring circuits, patching leaks, and fitting a new set of reinforced rubber hoses he'd traded for at the mill. Sweat stung his eyes, but determination steadied his hands. By sundown, the system stood reassembled, new hoses, new filter layers, and the generator humming quietly beside it. He tightened the last bolt, wiped his brow, and looked down at Buddy. "If this doesn't work, we're selling the barn, boy." Buddy barked once, as if calling his bluff. Samuel flipped the switch. The generator coughed, sputtered, then roared to life. The pump followed, groaning, then spinning into rhythm. Water began to flow, clearer this time. He bent down, catching a handful, letting it run through his fingers. For the first time, it wasn't brown. It was clean. He exhaled shakily, laughter breaking free from disbelief. Buddy barked joyfully, tail wagging furiously. Samuel looked skyward, voice breaking in the wind. "You see that, Laura? It's working." The sound of an engine interrupted the moment. Carl Moore's truck again, idling at the gate. But this time, Carl didn't get out. He just watched. His expression unreadable, somewhere between contempt and something that looked a lot like fear. Then he drove off without a word, dust swirling behind him. Samuel stared after him, the taste of victory bittersweet. The wind shifted suddenly, cold and sharp, carrying the faint smell of smoke from somewhere far beyond the hills. Buddy's ears twitched. Samuel frowned, whispering, "That's strange. There hasn't been rain or fire out that way for months." He didn't know it yet, but that smell was the beginning of the storm that would test everything he had built. Chapter 4. The night the fire roared. The sky over Maple Hollow turned the color of bruised copper that evening, a strange, feverish hue that made even the birds fall silent. The air was heavy with the scent of smoke, dry, acrid, and urgent. By sundown, the first tongues of flame had appeared along the ridges north of town, licking greedily at the brittle grass. Samuel stood on his porch, a wrench still in hand, staring toward the horizon that pulsed orange like the heartbeat of something monstrous. Buddy sat beside him, ears high, muscles tense. He could sense fear long before humans named it. The summer had been merciless. No rain for 43 days, wells sinking into dust, crops shriveled to brittle stems. Even the creek behind the diner had shrunk into a trickle. When the wind shifted southward, it carried the unmistakable roar of wildfire. Soon, church bells began to clang, a sound Maple Hollow hadn't heard in decades. Samuel tossed the wrench aside and ran toward the barn. "Come on, boy," he shouted. Buddy leapt after him, paws hitting the dirt with military precision. Inside the barn, the fire truck waited, its red frame newly polished from weeks of work. For the first time since he'd bought it, the old engine looked alive, its paint gleaming like a defiant heart. Maggie's truck appeared moments later, tires crunching over gravel. She jumped out before the engine stopped, apron dusted with flour, hair wild from the wind. "They said the fire's heading straight for the ridge," she gasped. "The town's hoses are dry, pipes burst near the main road. They can't hold it." Samuel's voice was steady, though his pulse hammered. "The engine's ready. We can get water from the pond by the dairy road." Maggie blinked, stunned. "Sam, that water's filthy." "Not anymore," he said, climbing into the driver's seat. "We'll filter it on the way." Buddy bounded up beside him, settling on the passenger bench. Maggie hesitated for only a second before climbing into the truck bed. "If we're doing this, we're doing it my way. I'm handling the pump." The fire engine sputtered once, coughed, and then roared awake, a sound so loud it startled crows from the trees. The headlights cut through the rising smoke as Samuel shifted into gear. Gravel sprayed behind them as they tore down the dirt road, the siren moaning like a ghost from the past. They reached the pond, a scum-covered pit reflecting the firelight in eerie ripples. The heat was already thick, the air tasting of ash. Samuel jumped down, unrolled the intake hose, and dropped it into the murky water. Maggie scrambled to connect the filter rig they had built weeks ago. Layered sand, charcoal, and ceramic packed into a drum now lashed to the back of the truck. Buddy circled the area, growling softly. His hackles rose. He didn't like the smell of the wind. "Pressure ready," Maggie called. Samuel turned the valve. The pump growled, then steadied into rhythm. Clearer water gushed from the nozzle, spraying in a high arc. It worked. Relief flickered in Samuel's chest, but there was no time to savor it. He jumped into the cab, shouted, "Hold on!" and the fire truck lurched forward toward the ridge where the town's small nursing home stood. The road was chaos. People hauling buckets, others shouting names through the haze. Smoke thickened, turning day into an orange twilight. As they neared the ridge, flames leapt across dry brush like living serpents. The nursing home sat at the edge, a modest building of pale stone now glowing with reflected firelight. Elderly residents huddled outside, some in wheelchairs, others clutching pets and photo albums. Their caretaker, Nora Fields, was a woman in her mid-40s with short-cropped brown hair and eyes lined with exhaustion. She ran toward the truck, waving frantically. "Water!" she cried. "The hydrants are dead!" "Not anymore," Samuel said, swinging the hose free. Maggie leapt down, opened the valve, and a jet of mist exploded into the air, cool and clean. She aimed it at the flames racing toward the building, creating a curtain of vapor. The fire hissed and rustled. Buddy barked orders of his own, darting between panicked residents, nudging one man's wheelchair out of harm's way. The flames clawed at the dry roofs, the air a furnace of crackling sound. Inside the nursing home, Samuel spotted light flickering through a window. The kitchen. He dashed toward it. The gas stove was still on, the heat swelling dangerously. Buddy followed, nose twitching violently. The dog let out a low, desperate growl and sprinted ahead. Beneath the counter, a propane tank trembled, metal pinging as pressure built. "Buddy, no!" Samuel yelled, but the shepherd lunged, pawing at the valve, teeth gripping the cloth handle. Samuel dropped beside him, grabbed the wrench, and twisted. The hiss cut off instantly, just as the first pane of glass shattered from the heat. They stumbled out into the open air as the wall behind them burst into flame. Maggie turned the hose their way, spraying down the doorway, coughing through smoke. They worked until their arms shook. The fire truck's tank ran low, the generator whining. Samuel glanced toward the field and froze. Beyond the smoke, the silhouette of Carl Moore's ranch shimmered like a mirage, the stables already ablaze. Horses screamed, trapped behind the fencing. "Sam!" Maggie shouted over the roar. "We can't reach it. Wind's too strong." He stared at the ridge, jaw tight. "We have to try. There's people out there." Maggie hesitated only a second before nodding. "Then let's move." The fire truck barreled across the pasture, tires crunching over scorched grass. Heat rolled off the earth in waves. When they reached the stables, the sight was harrowing, flames devouring the roof, the wooden beams glowing red. Carl Moore stood, near the fence, coughing, his shirt blackened with soot, eyes wild with panic. "Help me!" he choked. "The horses! They're still inside!" Samuel didn't hesitate. "Maggie, keep the water steady. Buddy, come!" Together, man and dog charged through the smoke. Inside, the air was unbearable, thick with sparks. Buddy's keen nose guided them through the dark. Samuel found the latch, yanked it free, and the terrified horses bolted out. But the ceiling groaned, a beam snapping loose. Carl stumbled forward, tripping on debris, pinned as fire spread toward him. Samuel lunged, grabbing his arm, pulling hard. The man's boot caught on a broken plank. Buddy darted forward, teeth clamping on Carl's sleeve, tugging with furious strength. With one final heave, they dragged him clear just as the roof collapsed behind them. Maggie swung the hose, dousing the falling embers that chased them out. They collapsed on the dirt, coughing, lungs burning. Carl stared at Samuel, disbelief etched in his soot-covered face. You saved me." Samuel didn't answer. He just nodded toward the truck. "Get in, or we're all next." They piled into the cab, Buddy wedged between them. Samuel hit the accelerator. The brakes screamed. Something was wrong. The heat had melted through the main line. The truck gained speed on the downhill slope, out of control. "Sam!" Maggie screamed. "Brake!" "It's gone!" he shouted back, wrestling the wheel. The truck skidded, tires smoking, sparks flying from the undercarriage. The ditch ahead yawned wide, waiting. Then Buddy moved. In one swift motion, he leapt between the seats, slammed his weight down on the handbrake lever. The metal shrieked, the truck jolted, fish-tailed, then stopped, barely, at the edge of the ditch, teetering before settling with a groan. For a moment, none of them breathed. Then Maggie began to laugh, half hysteria, half disbelief. He just saved us, she gasped. Buddy barked once, tongue lolling, chest heaving. Samuel reached over, resting a trembling hand on the dog's back. Good boy, he whispered, voice raw. The three of them sat there, bathed in the glow of distant fire and the sound of the world burning around them. The town's church bells had gone silent. Somewhere in the dark, the first drops of long-awaited rain began to fall, hissing against the hot earth. Samuel tilted his face upward, eyes closing as the water touched his skin. We made it, he murmured. But deep in the valley, where the fire still whispered, the wind carried a different sound, a low rumble, like thunder coming from the ground itself. The night wasn't done yet. Chapter 5. Clear water, warm hearts. By dawn, the fire was gone, leaving only the soft hiss of rain on cooling ash. The world smelled of wet earth and smoke, a strange perfume of survival. Maple Hollow, battered and blackened, stirred awake like an old man after a nightmare. The sun rose weakly behind the mist, turning the smoke to ribbons of gold. Samuel sat on the fire truck's running board, hands wrapped around a dented mug of coffee Maggie had made from what little clean water they had left. His hair was singed at the tips, his face streaked with soot and exhaustion. Buddy rested beside him, tail thumping faintly against the wheel. His fur was matted and dark from ash, but his eyes were bright, alive, ever watchful. Around them, the town emerged one by one from the ruins. People moved slowly, their clothes streaked with gray, their steps heavy but determined. The nursing home had been spared, its roof blackened but standing. Nora Fields limped over, a makeshift bandage on her knee, her face drawn but radiant. "We thought it was the end," she said hoarsely. Then that siren came through the smoke. She looked at the truck as though it were a living thing. "You saved us, Mr. Brooks. You and that dog of yours." Samuel shook his head. "We just did what had to be done." A small voice piped up from behind her. A little girl, no more than 6, in a soot-streaked nightgown, clutched a tin cup in both hands. "Can I have some?" she asked shyly. Samuel nodded, gesturing toward the hose line coiled at the side of the truck. The water that poured out was clear as glass, still warm from the engine's pipes. The girl took a sip, then looked up with tears bright in her eyes. "It's not muddy," she whispered. Others gathered, filling cups and jars, some simply cupping their hands. Old men who had scoffed at Samuel's rust bucket now waited in line, murmuring quiet thanks. Children crowded around Buddy, stroking his fur, hanging medals made of bottle caps around his neck. One boy kissed the dog's nose, tears cutting tracks through soot. Buddy took it all with noble patience, his tail brushing gently against every hand that reached for him. By mid-morning, Carl Moore arrived. His usual grandeur was gone, his fine clothes blackened, his hands blistered from hauling debris through the night. His silver hair, once slick and proud, hung damp across his forehead. The swagger had drained from him, leaving a man suddenly older, smaller. He stood before Samuel, hesitating like a schoolboy caught in guilt. "I came to say, thank you," he said finally. His voice cracked. "And I was wrong." Samuel looked at him quietly. "About what?" "About everything." Carl's gaze dropped to the muddy ground. "I thought money built things. Turns out it only buys fences to hide behind. You built something that saved us all." He paused, rubbing his roughened palms together. "If you'll let me, I'd like to help you keep it that way. I'll fund whatever you need, a volunteer fire and water unit. You run it. I'll just supply the tools." Samuel studied him, searching for mockery. There was none, only shame and sincerity, two things he'd never expected from the man. He nodded slowly. "All right, but you'll have to get your hands dirty this time." Carl managed a small smile. "I think that's fair." The idea spread through town faster than gossip ever had. By noon, a small crowd had gathered in front of the diner. Farmers, teachers, even teenagers, all offering time or scrap metal, bolts, and buckets. Maggie stood on the truck's step, voice ringing clear. "We'll rebuild the hoses, refill the tanks, and next time fire comes calling, we'll be ready to answer it ourselves." The crowd cheered, weary but full of something stronger than before, hope. Later that afternoon, Maggie found Samuel sitting by the truck again, tightening a valve that didn't really need tightening. The wind lifted strands of her silver-threaded auburn hair, and sunlight turned the laugh lines around her eyes to soft gold. She wore her usual flannel shirt rolled at the sleeves, grease stains on her palms from helping with the generator. "You know," she said gently, "you don't have to fix it every minute. It's already working." Samuel smiled faintly. "I just like hearing it breathe." She sat beside him, resting her hand over his, warm, steady, human. "You're not alone anymore, Sam." For the first time in years, he believed it. He turned to her, seeing not the widow who'd spent her days feeding others, but the woman who had stood beside him in fire and rain. "You sure you want to stick around a man who talks to old trucks?" Maggie laughed softly. "I'm rather fond of men who listen to them." Their hands stayed clasped, the moment unhurried, quiet as the settling dust. Evening brought a ceremony of sorts. The townsfolk erected a small wooden sign near the patch of grass where the fire truck usually rested. The paint was uneven, the letters carved by hand, but it gleamed proudly under the lantern light. Buddy's line, "Where water and hope begin." Children clapped when Buddy barked, tail wagging like a flag of victory. Samuel couldn't help but chuckle. Maggie leaned her head on his shoulder. "He's famous now," she murmured. "He's always been," Samuel replied softly. "We just finally noticed." As the weeks passed, the project took shape. They rebuilt a shed beside the barn, converting it into a small training space for dogs. The first batch of trainees arrived, mostly mutts and rescues. One, a three-legged border collie named Rusty, had a face too serious for his size, always watching Buddy as if studying a legend. Another was Daisy, a golden retriever with boundless energy who adored Maggie. Samuel and Maggie worked side by side, teaching the dogs to respond to whistles, to carry, ropes, to find objects in smoke. The laughter that once felt foreign to Samuel now filled the air daily, mixed with barking, clattering tools, and the rhythmic hum of the water pump. One crisp morning, as autumn began to touch the edges of the trees, the mayor came to visit. Harold Dean, a stout man in his 70s with suspenders stretched across a belly of authority, had a voice like a cracked bell and a heart as large as his handshake. He stood before the fire truck, hat in hand. "On behalf of Maple Hollow," he announced, "we declare this here engine an honorary member of the town." He chuckled. "Ain't every day a dead machine saves 100 lives." Maggie laughed, clapping with the others. Samuel simply nodded, pride rising like sunlight after long winter shadow. He looked at Buddy, who sat with perfect posture, chest out, eyes bright as ever. "You hear that, boy? You've got a title now." Buddy barked once, proud and content. That night, as lanterns glowed around the barn and people shared stew and stories, Samuel stood watching them. For the first time since Laura's passing, the ache in his chest didn't feel empty. It felt full of purpose, of noise, of warmth. Maggie came up beside him, brushing ash from his sleeve. "You did it, Sam." He shook his head. "No, we did." Buddy, hearing his name in the tone of family, wagged his tail and let out a deep, contented sigh before curling up by the fire truck's wheel. The stars above Maple Hollow shone clean again, unclouded by smoke. The town was still scarred, the hills still blackened, but the water in the tank gleamed clear as morning glass, ready for whatever came next. And somewhere in the quiet hum of the generator, Samuel swore he could hear something like a heartbeat, steady, alive, and at peace. When the flames finally died and the ashes cooled, what remained in Maple Hollow wasn't just a rebuilt town. It was proof that miracles don't always come with thunder or light. Sometimes they arrive quietly, through the hands of an aging man, the heart of a loyal dog, and the whisper of faith that says, "Don't give up just yet." Perhaps that's how God works, not in grand gestures, but in the small, stubborn acts of love that keep hope alive when everything else burns away. Every drop of clean water, every hand that reached out, was a reminder that he never left us. We just needed to believe again. So, if this story touched your heart, take a moment to thank God for the simple miracles in your life. The breath you take, the friend who stayed, the pet who still waits at your door. And if you believe kindness can still change the world, even a little, leave a comment below. Share this story with someone who needs faith today. Tell us about the miracle you've seen in your own life. And don't forget to subscribe, so together we can keep spreading hope, one story at a time. May God bless you, your loved ones, and every faithful heart that still believes in second chances.